The sound of whispered voices cut through the silence of the night, making Jack shrink further against the cold alley wall. His fingers clutched tightly to the piece of cardboard he used as protection against the biting wind. At just 12 years old, he already knew the city's shadows held dangerous secrets, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to hear. "It has to look like an accident," a woman's voice said, so cold that it made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand up. Andrew can't suspect a thing. The dim streetlight partially illuminated the woman's face. Sarah, the wife of the man she was now planning to kill. Jack recognized her instantly. It was impossible not to know the Thompson family in this town. Andrew Thompson, her husband, owned the largest construction company in the region, but unlike his wife, he was known for his generosity. Jack remembered the day, just 3 months ago, when Andrew had found him sleeping outside his company's doors. Instead of calling security, like so many others would, he sat beside the boy and shared his breakfast. From that day on, Andrew always made sure Jack had something to eat whenever he passed by. The elevator at the downtown construction site would be perfect, a man's voice replied. Jack recognized it as Nathan, Sarah's brother. He always does inspections personally. No one will question an industrial accident. Jack's heart pounded so hard he feared being discovered. His hands trembled, not from the cold anymore, but from the weight of what he had just overheard. Andrew Thompson was more than just a rich man who occasionally fed him. He was the only person who had treated him like a human being since he had run away from the orphanage. "Once he's dead, the company will be mine," Sarah continued, satisfaction lacing her voice. "Nathan will handle the finances, and no one will ever know." Jack squeezed his eyes shut, wishing this was just a nightmare. But the sound of Sarah's heels clicking against the asphalt as she walked away with her brother was all too real. He knew he had to do something, but who would believe a street kid? That night, while the city slept, Jack made a decision that would change his life forever. At first light, he stood at the entrance of Andrew's office, ignoring the wary glances from the employees arriving for work. When Andrew finally appeared, Jack felt his heart leap. "Jack, what are you doing here so early, kid?" The genuine concern in Andrew's voice almost broke the boy's resolve. But it was precisely that kindness that gave him the courage to speak. "Mr. Thompson, I need to tell you something important." Jack hesitated, glancing around nervously. "It's about your wife and your brother-in-law." Andrew's smile faded slowly, replaced by an expression Jack had never seen on his face before. In a matter of seconds, the man seemed to age years. Andrew Thompson's private office was an intimidating space for most people, but for Jack, sitting in a leather armchair far too big for him, it felt even more overwhelming. His hands clutched nervously at the cup of hot chocolate the secretary had given him as he watched Andrew pace back and forth, absorbing every word of his story. "Are you absolutely sure about what you heard, Jack?" Andrew's voice trembled slightly, betraying the composure he was trying to maintain. "Sarah and Nathan, they specifically mentioned the construction site elevator." Jack nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yes, sir. I know I'm just a street kid, but I swear I'm telling the truth." Andrew stopped pacing and looked deeply into the boy's eyes. At that moment, something shifted in his expression. The initial disbelief gave way to painful understanding. "You're not just a street kid, Jack. You're someone who risked a lot to warn me, and that means more than your social status." A heavy silence filled the room until the soft sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jack immediately tensed, but Andrew placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, I locked the door. No one's coming in without knocking. What are you going to do now, Mr. Thompson?" Jack asked, his voice small but filled with genuine concern. Andrew sat down heavily in his chair, running his hands over his tired face. "First, I need to keep you safe. Sarah, She can be very vindictive if she finds out you know anything." He paused, as if the next words were difficult to say. "She has always been ambitious, but I never imagined she'd go this far." Jack watched as Andrew picked up the phone, making a brief call. Minutes later, a middle-aged woman entered the office, Margaret, the housekeeper Jack had sometimes seen leaving food for the homeless near the company. "Margaret, this is Jack. He's going to stay at your house for a while," Andrew declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's a matter of security." The housekeeper smiled kindly at Jack, who felt a wave of relief upon recognizing her familiar face. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. I have a spare room that will be perfect for him." As Margaret discussed the arrangements with Andrew, Jack felt a confusing mix of emotions. On one hand, there was a fear of what Sarah might do if she found out. On the other, a strange and comforting sense of protection, something he had never experienced before. "Jack," Andrew called gently, pulling the boy back to reality. "I know you're scared, but I promise I'll take care of you. You showed more courage and integrity today than many adults I know." Andrew's words struck Jack like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. For the first time in years since he had run away from the orphanage, he felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him in the world. "Now," Andrew continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I need you to tell me every detail again. We're going to record everything, and then I'll make some calls. Sarah and Nathan have no idea they're about to face someone who knows exactly what they're up to." Jack swallowed hard but nodded with determination. As he retold the conversation he had overheard in the alley, he realized that his life had changed irreversibly. The invisible boy from the streets was now at the center of a battle that could cost lives, and surprisingly, for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Margaret's house turned out to be a warm refuge for Jack, with its cream-colored walls and the constant aroma of freshly baked bread in the air. After 3 days of living there, he was beginning to get used to the feeling of having a roof over his head and regular meals. Margaret had a special way of making him feel at home, as if he had always belonged there. That morning, as they had breakfast, the news report on the small kitchen television caught their attention. The anchor was reporting a fire at a document storage facility downtown. Jack's heart froze when he recognized the address. It was the central archive of Andrew's company. "Too much of a coincidence," Margaret murmured, her eyes meeting Jack's with concern. She immediately reached for the phone, but the call to Andrew went straight to voicemail. A sinking feeling settled in Jack's chest. Andrew had mentioned needing to gather evidence against Sarah and Nathan, documents that would reveal a history of embezzlement and financial manipulation. Now, those files had been reduced to ashes. The doorbell rang suddenly, cutting through the tense silence. Margaret gestured for Jack to hide in the back room, just as they had planned. Through a crack in the door, he watched as she opened the front entrance. His blood ran cold when he recognized the voice. "Good morning, Margaret. I hope I'm not disturbing you so early." Sarah Thompson's sickly sweet voice filled the space. "Andrew mentioned you were hosting someone, and I brought some welcome treats." Jack held his breath. How had Sarah found out? Panic threatened to take over, but years on the streets had taught him to remain absolutely still. "Oh, how kind of you," Margaret replied, her voice calm and unreadable. "But I'm afraid my nephew is still sleeping. Long trip yesterday. You know how it is." "Nephew?" Sarah let out a soft laugh. "How interesting. You know, Margaret, I've worked with people long enough to recognize when someone is lying." The sound of footsteps approaching made Jack's heart pound harder. He frantically searched for an escape route, but the room had only a small window, too high for him to reach. "Sarah," Margaret's firm voice cut through the air, "I think it's time for you to leave. Not until I see who's really here." Sarah's voice had lost all its sweetness. "Nathan, come in." The sound of breaking glass at the back door made Jack jump. He was trapped. But before he could think of what to do, the bedroom door burst open violently. Sarah stood there, her eyes gleaming with cruel triumph. But that wasn't what made Jack freeze. It was a figure behind her, a man he knew all too well, someone he never expected to see there. "Hello, Jack," the man said, a cold smile spreading across his lips. "It's been a long time since you ran away from the orphanage." Jack's world seemed to collapse. Standing before him was Peter Collins, the orphanage director, the man he had fled from 2 years ago after discovering his schemes to steal donation money. And now, somehow, he was working with Sarah and Nathan. "You two know each other?" Sarah asked, genuine surprise in her voice. "Oh, yes," Peter replied, stepping forward. "Jack here is very good at uncovering secrets he shouldn't. Aren't you, boy?" Margaret moved protectively in front of Jack, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination that transformed the gentle housekeeper into an unshakable guardian. "You will not touch this boy," she declared, her voice as solid as steel. Sarah laughed, a cold, soulless sound that seemed unfitting for the delicate face that had graced so many social pages. "Margaret, dear, don't make things complicated. This boy is a fugitive from the system. Peter is only here to take him back to the orphanage, where he belongs." Jack felt his back press against the wall, painful memories flooding his mind. The nights at the orphanage, the documents he had accidentally discovered, the children who mysteriously disappeared. It all started to make terrible sense. "The donations," Jack murmured, his voice quiet but clear. "The money that kept vanishing from the orphanage, it was going to you, wasn't it? To the company." Peter's smile faltered for a moment. "Always too clever for your own good, aren't you, Jack? That's why I had to be creative with your paperwork. Officially, you never existed in the system." Margaret took advantage of the distraction to reach for her phone on the table, but Nathan was faster. He snatched it from her hands and hurled it against the wall, shattering it. "Enough talk," Sarah snapped impatiently. "Andrew is busy dealing with the fire, thinking we destroyed his precious evidence." Her smile widened. Little does he know that the real documents, the ones that show where the money actually went, are safely hidden elsewhere. A little insurance policy against any inconvenience. Something stirred inside Jack, an inner strength he hadn't known he possessed. The streets had taught him more than just how to survive. They had given him a sharp instinct for decisive moments. "You're bluffing," he said, stepping forward. "If you really had those documents, you wouldn't be here. You're scared because you know Andrew has something on you, something the fire didn't destroy." Sarah's face paled slightly, and Jack knew he had struck a nerve. Peter lunged forward, but Margaret grabbed a nearby vase, brandishing it as a weapon. "Jack," Peter said, his voice now almost pleading, "you don't understand. This is bigger than you. Sarah and Nathan aren't the only ones involved. There are powerful people." A sudden noise outside made everyone freeze. Headlights flooded the windows, and authoritative voices rang out. "Police? The house is surrounded." Sarah's face twisted in fury. "What did you do?" she hissed at Jack. But it wasn't Jack who answered. It was Margaret, a small smile forming on her lips. "Panic button," she explained, pointing to a discreet device on her wrist. "Andrew insisted I wear it after Jack moved in. I never thought I'd actually need it." The doors burst open and officers stormed inside. Among them, to everyone's shock, was Andrew Thompson himself, his eyes burning with an intensity Jack had never seen before. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with both sorrow and determination. "It's over. The real documents were never in the archive. They were with someone I actually trusted." He turned to Jack, and in that moment, the boy understood his courage in telling the truth hadn't just saved Andrew's life. It had given him the time he needed to prepare a counterattack. In the tense silence that followed, Sarah looked at Andrew with a mix of contempt and something deeper, something that resembled fear. But it was Peter who spoke first, his voice trembling as the police placed handcuffs around his wrists. "I make so many innocent kids disappear from the system." The answer came from Sarah, her voice dripping with cold calculation. Because every child that disappeared was another story that could be rewritten, another document that could be altered, another money trail that could be erased. Jack's heart clenched as Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, including this particular story, she said, extending it toward Andrew. "Haven't you ever wondered why you cared so much about this boy in particular?" Margaret took a step forward as if to stop what was coming, but Andrew had already opened the envelope. His hands trembled as he read the documents inside. "No," he whispered, his face draining of color. "It can't be." Jack watched in confusion as Andrew staggered to the nearest chair. "What is it?" he asked, his voice small in the heavy silence of the room. "Jack," Andrew began, his voice thick with emotion, "your mother, she worked for me 12 years ago. Claire Bennett. She was my personal assistant before." He paused, taking a deep breath. Before the accident, the world seemed to spin around Jack. Claire Bennett, a name he had searched for in orphanage records for years, but Peter had always claimed didn't exist. She was the first to discover the irregularities. Sarah continued, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Nathan and I made sure she couldn't tell anyone. The car accident was so convenient, but we didn't account for the surviving child. You, Jack." Tears streamed freely down Andrew's face now. "I searched for you for years. Peter made sure all the records were changed, that your name was erased, that you disappeared completely. And then, by some miracle, you showed up at my company's doorstep. As Claire's son," Margaret added softly, her eyes shining with understanding. The boy Andrew had been looking for all this time. Jack felt his legs grow weak. All the nights he had spent on the streets, all the moments he had wondered about his family, about his past. And now, here was the truth, both painful and liberating. "You knew," he turned to Peter, his voice shaking. "You always knew who I was." Peter looked away, unable to face the accusation in the boy's eyes. "It was safer to keep you hidden. If Andrew found out the truth about Claire's death." "But he did find out," Nathan interrupted, speaking for the first time since the police arrived. "And now we're all going to pay the price." The sound of more police cars arriving filled the air, but Jack barely noticed. His world had narrowed down to Andrew, the man his mother had tried to protect, the man who had never stopped looking for him, the man who, unknowingly, had shown him kindness when he needed it most. Dawn arrived with a gentleness that felt out of place after the emotional storm of the previous night. In the living room of the Thompson mansion, Jack sat quietly, absorbing the reality of his new life while holding a faded photograph. His mother, Claire, smiling beside Andrew at a company event. "She had your eyes," Andrew said softly, sitting next to Jack, "and the same determined spirit. Claire always knew when something was wrong, and she never hesitated to do what was right." The past 24 hours had been intense. After the arrest, a flood of revelations followed. The record Sarah had hidden not only proved the current conspiracy, but also exposed a web of corruption stretching back years, starting with Claire's death. "Why did you never stop looking for me?" Jack asked, his voice small but firm. After all this time, Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories surface. "Because I promised her, Jack. On the last day I saw Claire alive, she was restless, saying she had discovered something terrible. She promised to tell me everything the next day, but..." His voice faltered. "When I heard about the accident, something inside me knew it wasn't really an accident. And then, when I found out there was a child who survived..." Margaret entered the room, carrying an old box. "I found this in the attic," she said gently. Claire asked me to keep it safe in case anything ever happened to her. With trembling hands, Jack opened the box. Inside, there was a journal, letters, and a small silver chain with a star-shaped pendant. She wore this every day, Andrew murmured, recognizing the necklace. As Jack flipped through the journal, an envelope slipped from between the pages. Inside was a letter addressed to him, written in delicate handwriting. My dear son, if you are reading this, it means my suspicions were right. Something is very wrong at the company. Something involving stolen money and ruined lives. Andrew is a good man, but he is surrounded by people who are not what they seem. I know this is dangerous, but I can't stay silent. Not when children are involved. Children like you, who deserve a better life. If anything happens to me, please know that every decision I made was to protect you and do what is right. Andrew promised to take care of you if anything happened to me. I know he will keep that promise, even if it takes time to find you. Trust him, just as I do, with all my love, Mom. Tears streamed freely down Jack's face now. Andrew pulled him into a protective embrace, his own tears mixing with the boys. She knew, Jack whispered. She tried to protect us all. Margaret stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. And she succeeded, dear. Through you, your courage in warning Andrew didn't just save his life. It brought to light the truth your mother fought so hard to reveal. Just then the phone rang. It was a lead investigator on the case. Sarah had begun talking, revealing names, dates, and connections. The full truth about Claire's death was finally coming to light, along with all the other crimes that had been covered up for years. 6 months passed, transforming not only the seasons, but also the lives of everyone involved. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and secrets, now overflowed with the warmth of a true family. Jack sat on the garden bench, the same place where his mother used to sit and write in her journal. The star-shaped pendant gleamed around his neck, a constant reminder of Claire's courage and the love that never faded. I figured I'd find you here, Andrew said, approaching with 2 cups of hot chocolate. It had become their ritual, sharing stories about Claire while watching the sunset. The judge called today. The adoption has been officially approved. Jack felt his heart swell with a joy he could barely contain. After months of legal battles and testimonies, he finally had a permanent home. So it's official? You're really my dad now. Andrew smiled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I've always been your dad, Jack. From the moment I promised your mother I'd take care of you. The papers just confirmed what our hearts already knew. Margaret appeared in the garden, carrying a box that Jack recognized. It was where they kept all the newspaper clippings about the case. The headlines told a story of justice. Sarah and Nathan had been sentenced, along with several others involved in the scheme. Peter had cooperated with authorities, helping locate other children who had disappeared from the system. Look what I found in Claire's old belongings, Margaret said, pulling out a photograph. It was a picture of Claire, pregnant, smiling radiantly beside a tree in the garden. She planted this tree when she found out she was expecting you, Jack. She said she wanted you to grow with strong roots and branches that reach for the sky. Jack looked up at the tree, now tall and majestic, its leaves dancing gently in the evening breeze. Just as his mother had wished, he had found his roots, not just in the earth, but in the love of a family that fate had unexpectedly returned to him. You know, Andrew said. Following Jack's gaze, your mother always said the truth has a way of finding its way to the light, no matter how long it takes. She was right, and you, son, were the messenger of that truth. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jack thought about his journey, from the cold streets to this moment of absolute belonging. He thought about the choices he had made, the fear he had faced, and the courage he hadn't known he possessed until he needed it. "I think Mom would be proud," he said softly, holding the star-shaped pendant. "She is proud, sweetheart," Margaret replied, wrapping him in a motherly embrace. Somewhere, she's smiling, watching how her brave son not only found his way home, but also brought light to the shadows she fought so hard to uncover. Andrew placed an arm around Jack's shoulders, and together, the three of them watched the first stars appear in the twilight sky. The Thompson mansion was no longer just a house. It was a home built on foundations of truth, courage, and unconditional love. And so, in the very shadows that had once hidden so many secrets, a new family flourished, proving that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find exactly where you're meant to be. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your connection to these narratives inspires us to keep bringing stories that move and transform. If you want more powerful stories like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Soul and History channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing these emotional journeys that remind us of the power of love, courage, and truth. See you in the next story.